Yeah, apologies for not having a paper handout for you. I think I made the mistake of emailing it so long ago that someone decided to lose it. No one here, I'm told. So my paper is called Partiality and the Guise of the Good. So like most people, I'm partial towards myself and towards those to whom I am related by the bonds of friendship, on a broad sense of friendship, where this includes family, at least in some cases, colleagues, some cases, compatriots, in some cases. I prefer things going well for us to things going well for others. However, things going well for us is no better than things going well for others. We, for example, are no more deserving of things going well for us than anyone else is. But if that's right, then my partiality seems misplaced, for it's wrong to prefer one thing to another if the one thing is not better than the other. That's what I'm going to argue here. I'm going to argue a bit more exactly by appeal to a version of what's known as the Guise of the Good thesis, that partial pro-attitudes, which is to say, pro-attitudes that manifest partiality, are incorrect. So I'm going to assume the Guise of the Good thesis and argue that partial pro-attitudes are incorrect. Critics of the Guise of the Good thesis can take this as a mark against it. Fans can take this as a problem that needs a solution, or they can accept this conclusion as a somewhat counterintuitive consequence of an independently plausible view. So the thesis is conditional, and it's there. So 3 parts. The second will be brief. Well, actually, they're all pretty brief. First is the longest. First part, I'm going to articulate the Guise of the Good thesis. In the second part of the paper, I'm going to present and very briefly defend the argument that partial pro-attitudes are incorrect. And in the third, sorry, this is annoying. This is the kind of typo that could make it very far if I don't nip it in the bud now. In the third, I'm going to explore the consequences of that conclusion that partial pro-attitudes are incorrect. So I'm going to articulate the Guise. This is part 1. I'm going to articulate the Guise of the Good thesis in my own way and in terms of the correctness conditions of pro-attitudes. But this formulation doesn't differ in spirit from other formulations that you may be familiar with, including those that speak of desire's aim or direction of fit, and indeed those that appeal to the idea that we desire things under the guise of the good. The formulation I'm going to offer here can avoid a number of standard objections to the Guise of the Good thesis. So I think that even though this is an assumption of the argument, the Guise of the Good thesis, I want it to emerge from this articulation in good shape. This is a sympathetic articulation. On this formulation, the Guise of the Good thesis is a thesis about pro-attitudes. Desiring or wanting, I take those to be the same. Desiring or wanting something is a paradigm pro-attitude, and pro-attitudes are sometimes characterized as being desire-like. Other pro-attitudes include those that are partially constituted by desiring or by some desire-like element or aspect, such as hoping, caring, and loving. And another pro-attitude that's going to be important in what follows is preference. So just as desiring something is a pro-attitude towards that thing, preferring one thing to another is a pro-attitude towards the former thing. So the Guise of the Good thesis says that pro-attitudes are evaluative representations. That's the view. And therefore have evaluative correctness conditions. Desires, for example, represent their objects as good and are correct if and only if their objects really are good. In other words, it is correct to desire X if and only if X is good. The same, mutatis mutandis, when it comes to preference. It is correct to prefer X to Y if and only if X is better than Y. Representations in the present sense are essentially things that can be correct or incorrect. Under what conditions are desires and preferences incorrect? So we've spoken of their correctness conditions. What about their incorrectness conditions? Well, here I'm going to assume as part of the Guise of the Good thesis, the following two claims. It's incorrect to desire X if and only if it is not correct to desire X, and it is incorrect to prefer X to Y if and only if it is not correct to prefer X to Y. Now, this is one point. We could maybe talk about this in Q&A if you want. This is one point where I think you could get off the boat. I mean, you can get off the boat anywhere, but this is a very interesting additional assumption. This assumption about incorrectness. You could reject that while accepting the correctness claim. Okay, what do I mean by correct and incorrect here? I mean to refer to representational correctness, which is a property had by representations when they're accurate or right, and representational incorrectness, which is a property that representations have when they're inaccurate, wrong, mistaken, or in error. Here's some relatively uncontroversial examples of representations. Pictures, at least some of them. Perceptual experiences, at least some of them. Assertions, all of them. And beliefs, probably all of them. All of these can be correct or incorrect in the present sense. Consider belief as a paradigm. It's correct to believe that P if and only if the proposition that P is true. That's the truth expressed by the slogan, truth is the aim of belief. Correctness, as it appears in my articulation of the Guise of the Good thesis, has the same meaning as it does in the claim that truth is the correctness condition for belief. You could put this point in terms of commitment if you like. Just as believing commits you to the truth of what you believe, desiring, for example, commits you to the goodness of what you desire. That's the view. So three important consequences of this clarification. Let me move down a little bit here for you. First, attributions of representational correctness and incorrectness are not prescriptive. To say that it is correct or incorrect for someone to phi is not to say that she ought or ought not to phi. This is obvious when we consider the case of belief. It's so obvious, I'm sure you've heard it denied though, so let's just dwell on it for a moment. It's obvious when you consider the case of belief. It's correct to believe that P if and only if the proposition that P is true, right? But that's not to say that you ought to believe that P if and only if the proposition that P is true, since there are true propositions you ought not believe, such as those for which you have no evidence, and non-true propositions you ought to believe, such as those for which you have sufficient but misleading evidence. Therefore, to say that it's correct to desire X if and only if X is good is not to say that you ought to desire X if and only if X is good. Second consequence, important consequence of the clarification. Attributions of representational correctness and incorrectness are not evaluative. To say that something is representationally correct or incorrect is not to say that it's better or worse than the alternative. There are lots of situations in which non-accurate representation is better than accurate representation. Consider again the case of belief. Sometimes having a false belief is better than having a true belief. This is obvious, although the extent of such cases is controversial. In any event, to say that it is correct to desire X if and only if X is good, for example, is not to say that it's good to desire X if and only if X is good. Third consequence of the clarification, attributions of representational correctness and incorrectness are not attributions of proper functioning. A properly functioning representational system might sometimes, or perhaps often, or perhaps even all of the time, instantiate incorrect representation. Think here of an organism whose evolved defenses against predation include a hypersensitive predator detection system that interprets any movement in its environment as the presence of a predator. This is the paranoid rabbit in an old paper by a psychologist named James Alcock. False representations of the presence of predators would be the normal result of her properly functioning predator detection system. In any event, to say that it's correct to desire X if and only if X is good is not to say that all and only desires for the good are the result of proper functioning. Okay, I'm going to assume, although this isn't essential, that the objects of pro-attitudes are propositions. And I think I'll just skip over a little discussion of that. But if people worry about that, how can a pro-attitude have as its object a proposition? We can discuss that. So as I mentioned, there's a number of standard objections to the Guise of the Good thesis that target the idea that desiring something does not require believing. They make the point that desiring something does not require believing that it is good. The present formulation avoids that. It's consistent with that point. So that's, I think, the big advantage of this way of formulating the Guise of the Good thesis. here's something that may be important. Pro-attitudes are evaluative representations, the thesis says. In the case of desire, desires represent their objects as good. We can distinguish, however, between things that are merely pro tanto good, in other words, things that are good in some way or respect and thus good to some degree, and things that are pro toto good, things that are best. Do desires represent their objects as pro toto good or merely as pro tanto good? The latter is more plausible. The reason is that inconsistent desires, and for example, or rather, by way of illustration of what I mean by inconsistent desires, desiring that P and desiring that not P, that's not per se irrational. And that's the reason that we should say that desires represent pro tanto rather than pro toto goodness. If desires were representations of pro toto goodness, on the other hand, inconsistent desires, inconsistent desires aren't per se irrational. Why not? Well, imagine you both want to eat the cake because it's delicious, but also to not eat the cake because it's unhealthy. There's nothing irrational about that combination of desires, perfectly rational desires. If desires were representations of pro toto goodness, however, inconsistent desires would be incoherent and per se irrational. The proposition that P and the proposition that not P can't both be best. It can't both be best to eat the cake and not to eat the cake. But the proposition that P and the proposition that not P can both be pro tanto good. Therefore, I think desires are representations of pro tanto goodness. So it's correct, we amend the Guise of the good thesis to the view that it's correct to desire X if and only if X is pro tanto good. However, if that argument was sound, I think preferences are representations of pro toto betterness, where X is pro toto better than Y, when X is not merely better than Y in some way or respect, and therefore to some degree, but better than Y overall, or on balance. The reason is that inconsistent preferences, by way of illustration, preferring X to Y and preferring Y to X, are per se irrational. They seem as irrational and bizarre as, say, believing P and not P at the same time. That preferences are representations of pro toto betterness would explain why this is so, why this is per se irrational to have inconsistent preferences. So it seems to me it's correct to prefer X to Y if and only if X is pro toto better than Y. All right, so finally, a little bit on the appeal of the Guise of the good thesis. We can appreciate the appeal of the Guise of the good thesis by considering a famous argument of Hume's. Hume appeals to the premise that, quote, a passion is an original existence and contains not any representative quality. In other words, he appeals to the premise that passions are not representations, and passions include both desires and preferences, and I'm going to assume that they include all the pro-attitudes. Given that passions are not representations, passions cannot be, quote, opposed by or be contradictory to truth and reason. And thus Hume concludes, quote, famously, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." So the Guise of the good thesis rejects Hume's premise. At least some passions, namely the pro-attitudes, are representations. And now the Guise of the good thesis can explain, by rejecting that premise, the Guise of the good thesis can explain what's wrong with his conclusion. It is not correct to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger, because the destruction of the world is no better. Indeed, it is quite a lot worse than the scratching of my finger. It speaks in favor of the Guise of the good thesis that it can elegantly explain why Hume's counterintuitive conclusion is false, as well as diagnose his mistake as deriving from his assumption that pro-attitudes are not representations. So now let me sketch the argument and say a little bit about relative goodness, because this is something I don't have on the handout, but I think Errol wants to talk about this, so I'm going to say a little bit about relative goodness. Here's the argument. Consider a case of partiality. We've both entered a raffle, and I prefer my winning the raffle to your winning, I prefer my winning the prize to your winning the prize. Assume the Guise of the good thesis. My preference is correct if and only if my winning the prize is better than your winning the prize, and incorrect otherwise. However, seems to me, my winning the prize is not better than your winning the prize, or so we can easily imagine. There's no relevant difference between us, nothing that makes, God, darn it. Is that that's no less blasphemous to say, God darn it, is it? Maybe it's a little less blasphemous, I don't know. Halfway, it's a halfer. My winning the prize is not better than your winning the prize, or so we can easily imagine. There's no relevant difference between us, nothing that makes me more deserving of the prize than you, no better consequences if I win and you do not, and so on. Therefore, my preference is incorrect, and generalizing from this case, partial pro-attitudes are incorrect. One way to avoid this conclusion is to reject the Guise of the good thesis, but is there another way, a way consistent with the Guise of the good thesis? Well, here's one possibility, again, not mentioned up here, having to do with relative goodness. So a natural thought at this point is that although my winning the prize is not absolutely better than your winning the prize, it is better for me. Moreover, so the argument would have to go, it's being better for me is sufficient for the correctness of my preference. Therefore, we must maintain, it is correct for S to prefer X to Y if X is better for S than Y. And the same mutatis mutandis when it comes to other pro-attitudes. For example, desire. We would say it is correct for S to desire X if and only if X is good for S. Is this plausible? Well, I think it has some unhappy consequences. Consider a variant on Hume's case. Imagine a faraway continent populated by millions of people unknown to me, whose destruction would have no effect on my well-being. And imagine that I prefer the destruction of this continent to the scratching of my finger. It's easy to imagine that the scratching of my finger would negatively affect my well-being. That's the idea, it's sort of, I don't want to be scratched. And thus, that the scratching of my finger is better for me than the destruction of this faraway continent, which will have no effect on my well-being. The present proposal therefore implies that my preference that the faraway continent be destroyed is correct. This seems wrong. Such a preference would be insane, perverse, contrary to reason, whatever you want to call it. It's better to follow Hume and reject the Guise of the good thesis and say that preferences cannot be correct or incorrect than to say that self-interested preferences are always correct. If the Guise of the good thesis is true, I want to say, preferring X to Y commits you to more than just that X is better for you than Y. It commits you to X being better than Y. Not just for you, not just for your friends, but better. Full stop. Preferences are representations of absolute betterness, not merely relative betterness. If I were to prefer the destruction of some faraway continent to the scratching of my finger, I would be committed to the destruction of that continent being better than the scratching of my finger. And not just better for me, but better full stop. And that is why such a preference seems insane, perverse, and contrary to reason. Note that this conclusion is consistent with the per se goodness of human well-being, or perhaps the per se goodness of well-being in general. Perhaps what is good for any human being is per se good. It does not seem that relative goodness in general is per se good. What is good for Microsoft is not per se good. Relative goodness is not a species of goodness, which is not to deny that some things that are relatively good are also good, just as relative truth is not a species of truth, which is not to deny that some things that are relatively true are also true. All right, that's all I have to say about relative goodness. So I have two more things to go over here. One is an idea of what we might make of the conclusion that partial pro-attitudes are incorrect, and then I'll say something about faith, hope, and trust. So suppose partial pro-attitudes are incorrect. What does that mean? Well, here's three things it doesn't mean. Recall the clarifications and the clarification made above and its consequences. First, since attributions of representational correctness and incorrectness aren't prescriptive, it doesn't mean that we ought not be partial in our pro-attitudes. Second, since attributions of representational correctness and incorrectness aren't evaluative, it doesn't mean that partial pro-attitudes are bad. Third, since attributions of representational correctness and incorrectness are not attributions of proper functioning, it doesn't mean that partial pro-attitudes are instances of malfunctioning. What it does mean, I think, is that partial pro-attitudes constitute a species of illusion. That's what would be true if this conclusion were true. Consider by way of comparison the kind of illusions involved in visual perception. There are illusions that occur in particular situations like the Mueller-Lyer illusion or the stick in water that appears bent, but also more systematic illusions such as that kind of illusion that I think is involved in color perception, and many others, but this is controversial, in which objects appear to instantiate qualitative properties that they do not instantiate. Illusions in this sense are inaccurate sense-perceptual experiences, a type of incorrect representation. Partiality constitutes a comparable species of illusion. So this understanding of the conclusion would go. My preferring my winning the prize to your winning the prize incorrectly represents my winning the prize as better than your winning the prize, just as my visual experience of the Mueller-Lyer lines incorrectly represents them as unequal in length. Just as some of our visual experiences constitute optical illusions, some of our proattitudes constitute conative illusions. Just as our awareness of optical illusions doesn't cause them to go away, our awareness of conative illusions doesn't cause them to go away. I know the Mueller-Lyer lines are equal in length, but my visual experience of them continues to represent them as unequal in length. This kind of conflict between belief and some other representational state is common and familiar and illustrated by the case of the Mueller-Lyer lines. So if that's what's going on in the case of partial proattitudes, that's not weird or strange. That's something we're familiar with. Our disposition towards incorrect visual experiences is not in general something that we ought to lament or try to change. Color perception, for instance, although it involves illusion, is a great benefit to members of our species. My argument leaves open the analogous possibility when it comes to conative illusions. Our disposition towards incorrect proattitudes, it could plausibly be argued, is not in general something that we ought to lament or try to change, because partiality, although it involves illusion, is a great benefit to members of our species. That's how the argument would go. Whether such an argument would be sound is one of the deep questions in philosophical ethics. It's the question of partiality and whether it's to be lamented or not. Hume describes taste. So back to, this is wrapping up the paper part, and then I'll have a little bit on faith, hope, and trust that's sort of an appendix. So Hume describes the faculty of taste as having what he calls a productive faculty, which by gilding and staining all natural objects with the colors borrowed from internal sentiment, raises in a manner a new creation. That was a quotation, if you couldn't tell. If partial proattitudes are incorrect, it seems that something like this can be said of partiality, that our partial proattitudes gild and stain ourselves and our friends with the appearance of being more valuable, more important, more significant than we really are. Okay, so let me say a little bit about faith, hope, and trust, and yeah, this will be right. It's supposed to be half an hour, is that right? Roughly, yeah, that's fine. Faith, hope, and trust, it seems to me, are proattitudes. They all have parts, elements, or aspects that are desire-like. I'm giving the sense that everyone thinks that, right? Everyone here? Maybe there's a few who don't think that. That has been mentioned a number of times so far, that there is a conative aspect or element to, at least to faith and hope, and I think plausibly trust as well. There's something strange. Why think this? Well, there's something strange about someone who claims to have faith that something awful will happen, or who claims to hope for the worst, or who claims to trust her friend to do something awful. That one's less clear, but I think you get the idea. And if faith, hope, and trust are proattitudes, that would explain why those things seem strange. So that's plausible. Now suppose that proattitudes are evaluative representations, as the argument suggests, given the Guise of the good thesis. If faith, hope, and trust are proattitudes, then faith, hope, and trust are evaluative representations, and therefore they have evaluative correctness conditions. So one consequence of this, I gather, is that in Dan's account, you could just collapse the evaluative condition and the conative condition, because the conative part is going to be an evaluation on this view. Now, I don't have anything settled to say. I thought about this for a while, and I couldn't come up with anything. I don't have anything really to say about the specific evaluative correctness conditions of faith, hope, and trust. But I think they're going to have evaluative correctness conditions if they're proattitudes, and if I'm right, or if the argument is right, that proattitudes are evaluative representations. But I'm uncertain whether my conclusion that partial proattitudes are not correct or incorrect incorrect was the conclusion, has any interesting implications when it comes to faith, hope, and trust. Our patterns of faith, hope, and trust seem, at least at first glance, to manifest our partiality. We have faith in ourselves and in our friends, but not in other people. We hope that things will go well for ourselves and our friends, but we have no such hope for other people. We trust ourselves and our friends more often and to a greater degree than we trust other people. Suppose, for example, that you hope your daughter's basketball team will win the game. Is there any evaluative difference between your daughter's team winning and the other team winning? Perhaps between the members of your daughter's team winning, perhaps between your daughter in particular and the members of the other team, that would vindicate the correctness of your hope. It seems implausible that there is, at least in general, such a difference. But there's a phenomenon that complicates this and makes me wonder whether our patterns of faith, hope, and trust really do manifest partiality, at least all the time. So it's sometimes said that you can't be proud of another person's accomplishment. And there's some truth to this idea, but I'm not certain what it is. So on the one hand, it seems like the idea ought to be formulated in terms of obligation or propriety. It ought to be formulated like this: you ought not be proud of another person's accomplishment. There would be something improper about doing so. But on the other hand, there's something compelling about the idea that someone who says she is proud of someone else's accomplishments is not really proud, but has mistaken some other attitude, admiration maybe, for pride. Moreover, this idea is more compelling when we think of people who are or claim to be proud of the accomplishments of unaffiliated strangers than it is when we think of people who are or claim to be proud of the accomplishments of their friends and other people with whom they are somehow affiliated. It would be intuitively somehow absurd if I were to be claimed...
Gall darn it.
Gall darn it. Zounds. Zounds has sort of become okay, right, over time. That's right. It's just incorrect. So I think it would be somehow absurd if I were to be claimed to be, if I were to claim to be proud of your daughter, a stranger to me, for doing something, whereas there would be no such intuitive absurdity, I think, if I were to claim to be proud of my own daughter. And I think anyone who says otherwise is in the grip of a theory. So you run into people who say, no, you're not proud of her. You're really proud of your contribution to her success or something like that. And I think that's a very strange, I can see how there could be a theory that would force you to say that you can only be proud of things that you have, actions that you have performed or something like that. But I don't think that's not the sort of intuitive data. In any case, I think at least this much seems kind of plausible. We ought not be proud of the accomplishments of unaffiliated strangers. We ought not or cannot be, or something like that. And so I should say, and that's not for sort of reasons of partiality. So that's just a phenomenon of pride. Now, might something similar be said of faith, hope, and trust? There's something fishy. This would be the idea. There's something fishy about faith, hope, and trust when they're directed at unaffiliated strangers. In some situations, this seems like it's down to insufficient evidence. You say you have faith that I will be a good father, but how can you say that, given that you hardly know me? But in others, it seems like it's down to something more like considerations of privacy and discretion. Think of someone who professes hope that you will recover from an illness after learning about it by eavesdropping. It's like, get your hope out of my space, is, I think, a kind of reaction you might have in that kind of case. So faith and hope, you might think, can be unwelcome, perhaps in a way that other pro-attitudes can't. So I haven't come close to having thought this through or expressed this all clearly here, but I think this might provide a way of understanding the apparent partiality of our patterns of faith, hope, and trust as something other than partiality. Just as we display no partiality when we confine our pride to our own accomplishments. That's what pride is. It's supposed to be about your own accomplishments. It's not partial. You're not being like selfish or partial or egoistic or self-centered to be proud only of stuff that you and your friends have done. Perhaps we can say the same about faith, hope, and trust. Perhaps we display no partiality when we direct our faith, hope, and trust at ourselves and our friends. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Now, Errol Ford.
right, so first thing to say is thanks to Allan for the paper, and thanks for coming to listen. Okay, so normal people are partial. Not just most people, but normal people. They're partial towards friends, projects, and hobbies, and they're partial both in attitude and in action. Right, so for example, my desire that my daughter's life go well is stronger than my desire that a stranger's equally worthy daughter's life go well. Similarly, I prefer that my wife be happy to an equally worthy person being happy who happens to be a stranger to me. So Allan's paper seeks to show that given the assumption that pro-attitudes like desires and preferences are evaluative representations, partial pro-attitudes like the ones I have towards my daughter and wife are incorrect. Okay, so there are a lot of reactions you could have in response to the conclusion. Right, so you could see it as a mark against the Guise of the good, or that particular Guise of the good thesis. You could see it as a mark against partial attitudes, or you could see it as an uncomfortable consequence that we just have to live with. So Allan doesn't quite tell us what he thinks our reaction should be, although this is a case where the intonations of giving the paper make a difference to what point you take the upshot to be. When I read the paper, I thought he was being more neutral than he sounded like just now. Although I believe they were the same words, so okay. So he does tell us that our partial pro-attitudes are a species of illusion, but that there might be good reasons for thinking that we should live with the illusion. And whether we should is, in his words, one of the deep questions in philosophical ethics. Okay, so I guess I think many people will probably react to this by giving up the Guise of the good, or at least his version of the Guise of the good. So I like the Guise of the good, or I like something like that, and so I kind of want to find something else. And so I am going to end up giving up, or suggest some ways to give up his very particular version of it, although what I say is in the spirit of the general idea. Okay, so I think that the problem lies in one of Allan's assumptions about evaluative perception, and that's the assumption that the correctness conditions for the attitudes in question are determined by impartial value. So I guess I should say now, I'm not clear about this in what I wrote up, that you could have relational impartial value, and so it's not necessarily the relational versus the absolute. The partial impartial is going to cross-cut the relational absolute. Although I'm going to just kind of go on to assume that that's not true and that all the relational value will be partial. Okay. All right, so while this assumption, the assumption that the correctness conditions are determined by impartial value, is a natural one to make in the context of doing analytic ethics, or at least around here, it should immediately raise the hackles of anyone interested in defending a partialist view of morality, or at least anyone who's sympathetic to the Guise of the good who wants to defend a partialist view. Okay, so my plan is threefold. So in the first two sections, I'm just going to explore two different ways of resisting Allan's assumption, and then in the last section, I'll say something about faith. All right, so the first option, which I'll do quickly. Okay, so the first option for resisting the assumption is to hold that the relevant attitudes represent relational value rather than impartial value. So relational value, as the name suggests, is relational. And on the most well-known relational views, or at least the ones that I'm thinking of, particular agents are one of the relata. So according to Michael Smith's version of the view, what's valuable relative to me is determined by what my ideal counterpart would desire for me. Okay, so just that's the kind of view that I'm thinking of. So someone like Smith, I think, has ample motivation for holding that evaluative representational attitudes represent relational value. So here's two motivations. So first, relational value enthusiasts have long sought to justify partiality in action by appealing to relational value. So that's more or less the main thing that Smith wants to do with the notion of relational value, is explain how you can be a consequentialist and still have justified partiality. So if you think, that's the justification for why partiality is justified in action, then it's natural to think that that's what we're tracking. Those are the facts that we're tracking in evaluative perception. Okay, so that's the first motivation. The second motivation, and this is more important, is that Smith has argued that all value is relational in this way. And so he does think that there's something like impartial relational value, but he doesn't think there's anything like absolute impartial value. And if that's right, then evaluative representations must be representing relational value if they're veridical at all. In other words, the burden has just gone up on Allan, now he's got to be a full-blown error theorist about evaluative perception if he's going to maintain his version of the Guise of the good. Okay. Alright, so Allan does consider the view that pro-attitudes represent relative value, but the only version of this view he considers holds that pro-attitudes represent prudential value, or good form. And that is a silly view, and he rightly criticizes it. But Smith's view just doesn't have the most obvious vices of that view, so it doesn't have the problem with the people in the far-off continent. It can easily suggest that it's incorrect to desire the pricking of, to prefer the pricking of your finger to them being destroyed. Okay, so that's the first option. So now the second option. So I raised the first option just to get it on the table. It's not the one that I like the most. So the option I prefer maintains that the relevant attitudes do not represent the good per se. Instead, they represent their objects as having certain practical importance. Now, on some views of practical importance, something's practical importance is just determined by its impartial value, or by impartial value in some way. But I think if we're seriously going to explore a partialist moral theory, we need to reject that assumption. Okay, so where should we look for alternative views of practical importance? So a natural place, I think, is the literature on the justification of partiality. So most of the theories in that literature are theories about why acting partially is morally permitted or required. But it's easy enough, I think, to generalize to desires to, or pro-attitudes. So I'll give an example of a view like this, and this happens to be the view that I defend. It's a coincidence. Okay, so according to this view, impartial considerations provide reasons of all sorts. So reasons to act, reasons to intend, and reasons to have pro-attitude. And it's fine with me if this is absolute impartial, just like the most Morean thing that you can think of. That's fine. Okay, so the impartial considerations provide reasons. However, the weight of those reasons is not just a function of the weight of the impartial considerations. So the weight of the relevant reasons is also sensitive to facts about which relationships you stand in with things. And so facts about relationships can intensify the practical importance of various reason-providing facts. And that's why I think you're justified in being partial, at least in action, but also in attitude. Okay, so given that view, here's the proposal about Guise of the good, or Guise of the normative. So our evaluative, or perhaps better, our normative perceptions present things as having certain practical importance. And since the practical importance of something can come apart from its impartial value, it's possible that our normative perceptions are correct, even if they do not jive with the impartial axiological facts. And not only is that possible, I think it's very often actual. So my desire that my daughter's life go well is a representation of the practical importance of my daughter's life going well. And I'm willing to say, given my relationship with my daughter, the practical importance of my daughter's life going well is greater than the practical importance of some stranger's daughter's life going well. Okay. Okay, so there's the two ways. So now let me say something about faith. Okay, so on the view I like the most about the kind of faith that interests me the most, and lots of qualifications for Trent's sake, faith is a complex mental state composed of a pro-attitude and a cognitive state of acceptance, so very similar to what Dan was talking about. Furthermore, I think the justification of acceptance in faith is intimately connected to the justification of the pro-attitude. So acceptance is justified by practical reasons to take a stand about the proposition accepted, which are largely a function of the desirability of particular outcomes. Or the simple version is the desirability of the thing that you have faith in. Thus, if the relevant pro-attitude presents its content as having a certain practical importance, then we should expect that faith has what we might call partial profile. And that's because both our reasons to have the pro-attitude that is part of faith and our reasons to accept the relevant proposition will be intensified by facts-bound relationships. And that's because those are just, in most cases, those are just the same reasons. Okay, so that seems to mesh with some of Allan's intuitions about faith, or at least about the extension of which faith is rational or something like that. Furthermore, it's compatible with and friendly to the thought that faith is often rational, even though it has this partial profile. Or, I'll say it in terms of correctness, if you like. It's compatible with and friendly to the thought that faith is often correct, even though it has a partial profile. All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Errol, for those excellent comments and a lot of stuff that it's really helpful that I'm still sort of digesting and thinking about there. So I think I just have three try to say these things really quickly. The one is, it occurred to me just now that I think we have to be, or I have to be, quite careful when talking about what reasons we have to have an attitude like a pro-attitude, what the justification for that attitude is, and the rationality of a particular pro-attitude or combination of pro-attitudes. So that, on the one hand, be quite careful talking about that, and then talking about the correctness conditions of an attitude on the other hand, because on my view, those two things are going to be quite different. So it's possible for someone to have very good reason to have a particular attitude, and yet that attitude be incorrect. That's the case of justified false belief. So the relationship between the rationality, reasonableness, and justification of an attitude and its correctness conditions is super interesting. And in the case of belief, I mean, in some ways, I think that question is one of the basic questions in epistemology: the relationship between justification of belief and the correctness conditions of belief. In other words, the relationship between justification and truth. So I haven't given enough thought to how the rationality, reasonableness, and justification of pro-attitudes relates to the fact about their correctness conditions, if it indeed is a fact. But I just wanted to reiterate that the claim that a particular pro-attitude is incorrect does not mean that it's unjustified or irrational or that we don't have most reason to have it. But it gets tricky, and I haven't thought through exactly what the relationship between the rationality of attitudes and their correctness conditions is. Two other thoughts. One is about Smith. So Errol thought that if we moved to Smith's view, we would avoid the kind of objection that I had, and I don't know if that's so. So here's what I was thinking we would have to do if we moved to Smith's view. So I think let me say this. So on Smith's view, what's my understanding is what's valuable relative to me is what my maximally informed, what I would choose if my desires were maximally informed, coherent, and unified. So if that's relative value, and if pro-attitudes represent relative value as opposed to absolute value, then I think we're going to have to say something like this in the case of desire: that it's correct for S to desire X if and only if S would have, if only if S would desire X were her desires maximally informed, coherent, and unified. That's just to say that it's correct for S to desire that X if and only if the proposition that P is, it's correct for S to desire that P if and only if the proposition that P is good relative to her. Now let's try to extend this to preference, which is what I was talking about mostly in the paper. I think the natural extension to preference goes like this: it's correct for S to desire X to Y. This is not big enough for me to see, which is weird. I'm getting old. Let me make that bigger. It's correct for S to prefer X to Y if and only if S would prefer X to Y were her preferences maximally informed, coherent, and unified. I think that's what the Smithian version of the Guise of the Good thesis would look like in the case of preference. But maybe this is obvious, but the Hume-inspired counterexample threatens this account just as much as it threatens the account I proposed in the paper, which was in terms of prudential value or what is valuable for an individual. So some mad person might prefer the destruction of some faraway continent to the scratching of her little finger, the scratching of her little finger. And it seems to me it could be the case that she would still prefer this, even were her preferences maximally informed, coherent, and unified. She is just a nasty and selfish person. And I, following Hume, think that being nasty and selfish is not necessarily a sign that your preferences are ill-informed, incoherent, or ununified. It's not knowledge or rationality that keeps us from being nasty and selfish, on my view. It's something else in our nature. So that was the first thought. Final thought is that I want to think a lot more about Errol's proposed version of the Guise of the Good thesis that he prefers, but let me voice my worry about it in advance, and then I'm going to think about it more and see if this worry is real. I think I disagree that pro-attitudes in general can be understood as representations of practical importance, because I think some but not all pro-attitudes have an essential connection to action that would be implied by that view, but some but not all. So I think choice and intention, if those are even two different things, choice and intention, if they are pro-attitudes, have an essential connection to action. And it would make sense to say, and Nishi Shah says something like this in a recent paper, it would make sense to say that intentions are representations of the to-be-doneness of actions. So I could see an essential connection between intention and action, choice and action. That's fair enough. But I think other pro-attitudes, and I would include desire and preference in this category, do not have this kind of essential connection to action. Why not? Well, this involves the reasons to endorse the Guise of the Good thesis in the first place, and I didn't address this in the paper hardly at all. But let me just say something sketchy and suggestive of what the issue is here. It seems to me that some of our desires and preferences represent nothing about action because they are essentially spectatorial. I think I wrote this in the middle of the night. That's a new word. Spectatorial. To think paradigmatically of the desires and preferences of sports fans who want desperately for their team to win, I think it's implausible to say that they represent their team winning as having practical importance. There's no relevant action that they might perform. There's obviously a lot to be said here, but I mentioned this only to give you a sense of why I want to resist positing an essential connection between pro-attitudes in general and action. Thanks.